In a time of rapid changes in the federal government, you might have missed one of the most consequential shakeups: the closure of 18F. Between Senate speeches, agency closures, and mass layoffs, the dismantling of this small but mighty federal digital team barely made a ripple. But its loss may deprive the people of a wave of government savings and service improvements. So, if you care about how government works, or more importantly, how it should work, this is one upheaval you need to understand. Today, we're going to explore what made 18F special, why it faced resistance, and what lessons its story offers for the next iteration of digital government. Hillary, one time director, co founder of 18F, let's start with you. What the heck is 18F and what did it do and what was your role there?
Thanks, Kevin. 18F was essentially a consultancy inside the US federal government trying to build great digital services. And I use the word consultancy pretty specifically. A lot of digital services teams have started since GDS, the Government Digital Service in the UK, started since USDS. And 18F was always shaped a little differently, and we always kind of had that consultancy bone in our body. We really wanted to be the team that program owners could come to for advice, for help, for just encouragement on how to get started, and we would work with them to take on their, help them figure out their problems, figure out what they needed, and then build stuff.
So, Hillary, you were obviously in the meat and bones of that effort of this consultancy. Dave, what was your relationship to 18F? How did you become familiar with this quirk of the federal government that people probably haven't heard of prior to its closure and perhaps haven't heard of since?
So I had been advising Code for America and had been responsible for the kind of education of the fellows in Code for America. And through that, when the Presidential Innovation Fellows program got started, which preceded all of this, but was a kind of first effort to bring technology talent into the government and kind of start to think about how we could be doing things differently, I was invited to come and speak to the Presidential Innovation Fellows. In fact, the fellows requested me. I was the first person they requested to have come in. So that was a real privilege. And I was like, oh, these are really great and interesting people. And then the following year, Jen Pahlka, who had founded Code for America, then moved to the White House and said, would I come and do kind of a 1 or 2 day training for the Presidential Innovation Fellows? And that's when I met many of the people who would go on to become kind of instrumental in the creation of 18F. And so that was maybe not my first contact with 18F, but it was first contact with the people who would make it happen. And, some of them I knew from before, some of them I met there. And I was just kind of following them in their journey, which continued. That they founded it. I wanted no role in doing that, but was always very supportive. But then I was brought in every year subsequently to help, do a training program for the Presidential Innovation Fellows and had a lot of friends there. And then ultimately ended up at Harvard, where I was convening digital teams from around the world. And naturally, 18F was a, core part of those people coming together.
So of the people who know about 18F, I'm going to put you all at the top 1% of 18F knowledge. So we are very lucky to have you help explain its importance and the significance of its closure. And with respect to that significance, I want to point out that if you pick up the Constitution, as I do too frequently, or perhaps not enough, depending on who you ask, you won't find in Article 1, Section 8, some mention of Congress shall create a consultancy that will help it improve digital services. The founders apparently weren't ready for the digital era. So, Hillary, can you help me understand, when did 18F emerge? Did it just show up one day? People said, hey, I'm smart and I know tech. Can I help the government? What gave rise to the creation of 18F?
It was really a confluence of events and a lot of different factors. So I was a Presidential Innovation Fellow in the second cohort. So the first cohort Dave talked about was 2012. And then I was a fellow in 2013. And 2013 was a bit momentous in a few ways. One, there was a website that failed fairly spectacularly.
What? No
yes.
way. Not a federal government website. Surely not.
That happened to be pretty critical to President Obama's mandate. So, of course, I'm talking about healthcare.gov. pretty much at the same time, if I remember the timing correctly. But there was also a government shutdown, which I don't think had happened in a while. And so there were a lot of us furloughed for a little while. There were also folks that had been sent off to the quote unquote rescue effort for healthcare.gov. And there was just this, this like itch. We can do this better. We know we can do this better. And so there was a lot of kind of behind the scenes momentum in that period. But what I'll say is that by no means was sort of like the seed of all of this, because Jennifer Polka, who was the founder of Code for America and had worked with David and brought him in to train the fellows, she had been essentially brought into the White House as a deputy chief technology officer that year, 2013. So we were serving at the same time. And one of her mandates was really think about, she had gotten to know the people behind GDS in the UK. She'd really been able to see the positives and the negatives of the fellowship model, and knew that really to drive this long term, we had to think about capacity differently, and we needed to be thinking about in-house capacity. So that was really something she was focused on during 2013 when I was serving as a fellow. So by the time all of us were furloughed and sitting around and agitated and trying to figure out what we were going to do next, there was already a lot of groundwork laid for this to happen. So a lot of fellows had been hired into the General Services Administration. My role was inside GSA, and there were several of us inside GSA that year. And the administrator, Dan Tangerlini, became a champion, kind of in conversations with Jen and others about how are we going to do this. For a while, we were jokingly starting a team and calling them perma-PIFs. He was very interested in, okay, how do we get this capacity to stick around and do great work? So that was really kind of how it happened. In October and then through the end of the year, we started having serious conversations about what it would look like to get a group, a cohort of folks to stick around beyond the end of their fellowship date and become perma-PIFs. So that was kind of the seed of it.
I'm looking forward to one day finding on someone's resume perma-PIF and being like, oh, I talked to Hillary Hartley. I know what that means. Congratulations. But what's really intriguing to me is you're pointing out, obviously, the severe need. If we have healthcare.gov crash, alarm bells going off across the country, we can't make a website, right? And that's just obviously gave rise to a clear need for something like assistance from smart tech folks to come in. And what's crucial here is it wasn't a call to Booz Allen or it wasn't a call to McKinsey. It was a call to folks already in the government. But Dave, can you help us understand why the existence of talent being there already having those PIFs, those Presidential Innovation Fellows in place, already having kind of tech savvy people be a part of the government, was so essential to getting 18F off the ground to begin with and then to its kind of early successes?
Yeah, so two things I want to talk about. First is I do want to say there's like an international context that matters here as well. Like it wasn't just the United States that was facing this problem. Many countries, it's just, I want to remind everybody, like we think of healthcare.gov as like kind of recent history, but if you're a 25-year-old, like in my class doing a master's of public administration, you were like 12 years old when healthcare.gov happened. Like it's like, you're like, it's as deep history as like the 1970s is to, people listening to the podcast. But so I just want to remind some of the listeners on this call, like this was a transformational moment where there was a real crisis and a core policy that was going to benefit tens of millions of people could not happen because the technology was not working. It really presented a crisis of confidence in the government's ability to execute. And the United States was not the only country to have this problem. There had been a similar crisis in the UK, actually involving healthcare as well, that happened about 10 years earlier or so, where they spent like close to $10 billion on a healthcare record system that basically didn't work out. Like the money just was all wasted. And it also was a huge crisis of confidence, the government. And there was this realization that we can't just outsource everything. We have to have some capacity, if only to understand how to define the problems and choose people to do the work. We have to have some internal capacity. And it may be that we need to have some capacity that actually can build. Like, it might be cheaper and better and easier if we build some things in-house, partly just to do with that, but partly just to keep the capacity so we can evaluate the people we are outsourcing more effectively. And so that realization was starting to dawn. But I think just to really kind of, the big thing was going on is governments were finally wrestling with the fact that the internet was a thing, that people expected to get services on it. And they were very slowly realizing that the entire government actually runs on technology. And now citizens are interfacing directly with that technology to get services. And we don't have a ton of models or ideas about how to operate in this way.
And Hillary, it's hard to have this conversation and not mention Doge, right? I'm sure for a lot of listeners right now, the thing that's already come to mind is, oh, so you're telling me a bunch of tech-oriented people showed up to the government one day and said, hi, we're here to fix things, and we know more about the latest technology than you do. What is distinct about how 18F operated as opposed to how Doge is operating right now? And to the extent you want to explore Doge and comment on that, that's fine. If you'd prefer to focus explicitly on how 18F function, that's also fine. I'll leave it to you.
I will be clear that I don't know if I know how Doge is operating. And I don't know if they know how they're operating in terms of this work, in terms of what they're going to do, in terms of building. I've been paying attention to some of the news. I've been following along with what the folks inside GSA currently are talking about. And really, they're putting all of their eggs in the AI basket. And that's a whole other podcast. So, I don't know that I know enough to understand really what they're thinking or how they're operating. But I do know that 18F, USDS, public servants writ large, when you go into public service, you take an oath and you understand, you understand probably the pay cut maybe that you took. You understand that you are there for a bigger mission. And that was, we felt that. It's one of the reasons that so many of us wanted to stick around after our fellowships. I was on a leave of absence from a technology company and didn't want to leave. I didn't want to leave. I guess I didn't want to go back. I wanted to stay and, keep making a difference inside government. It takes a lot to push those boulders uphill, but it's worth it. And I think one of the things that we all recognized was that, David talked about, outsourcing capacity. But the problem is that for decades, government outsourced its mission. And when you outsource your mission, that's when you're in trouble. Because not only do you not have inside capacity to understand if the vendors are telling you that you're on the right track or what your actual problem is, you need people inside to understand your actual problem, what users actually need, and what's going to fix it. Then you go ask for that. And government didn't have that for a long time. And if there's a kernel of what I think all of these groups are trying to do, yep, we're building some awesome things sometimes. But I think that's like the thing that if we can turn that Titanic around, that's the thing that really shifts the conversation. And that's what I don't know if DOGE really understands.
Yeah, Dave, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I love this thing about the mission. I think, again, I want to link it back to like understanding how government works in a digital era. Because you have to understand, we've had computers in government since 1950s, but it's mostly been running back office systems. What shifted kind of mid 2000s and then particularly took off after 2010 was this notion that people were going to interact directly with their government over a website or a mobile device. You understand, like in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, if you interacted with a citizen, they came into your office. And so you learned something about them. Like you knew these people, like you knew what their needs were, you knew what their problems were, you knew what the edge cases looked like. And the people who were like the public servants sitting in those offices, they knew how to navigate those edge cases. They knew how to deal with people. But when everything moves to a website, the people get abstracted away. Like you don't actually know where they're struggling unless you are building monitoring into your website. You don't know where the edge cases are. You don't know who's dropping out. And it's this weird, like this implicit skill of understanding people, which existed distributed in these offices gets disappeared. And you now have to make this implicit skill an explicit skill of the government. And so part of what Hillary's talking about is like, you don't know your mission. Is part is you don't know your citizens anymore. You don't know your residents. You don't know the public, because you're not touching them. And so it's weird, like in the digital era, we have to build all these new skills, part of which are very technology focused, but part of them actually are very, very human focused, because we have to make the human part even more explicit.
And I do want to, and I apologize, I promise this won't just become the Doge podcast, but something I want to highlight that, Hillary, I'd love your comments on would be, I think everyone, all else equal, would say, do you want more tech savvy people in government? They'd say yes. The second question now may be, do you want to make sure they are accountable and transparent in their actions? They would also say, hell yes, or some variant of that. So can you describe a little bit more about how 18F interacted with agencies, how there was a sort of heightened accountability and transparency built into its work to give people an understanding of what it actually meant for the 18F to show up at an agency's door?
Yeah, I think it's a couple factors. One is from the moment we really wrote our first or second blog post, we talked about being an open source team. So
you had a blog. Let's just focus on that, right?
Sure.
Let's point that out, right? Openly accessible. I'm guessing you wrote in plain language, right? Available to anyone who wanted it. So even that fact, I think, is worth calling out. But please continue.
Well, you're exactly right. So we had a blog, and we had to go through GSA comms occasionally to get things published, but they were usually really happy to work with us on what we wanted to put out. And our thesis around the blog was building on what we had seen, be successful in other jurisdictions, was that it was a tool for us to document kind of how we were doing and what we were learning, but to share that, so that to try to be open about successes, failures. Nobody ever blogs enough about their failures, but we sort of tried to talk about the meat. We tried to talk about the work, not just put press releases out. And so that really was at the heart of the 18F blog was the work. Here's how it's going. Here's what we're doing. Here are the tools we're using. And it's powerful as a transparency tool. I'll be honest, it's powerful as a recruiting tool. Even simple things like maybe you see a photo in one of the blog posts and somebody's using a Mac, and people think the government teams are using Macs. I didn't know. So, but it's little things like that. So one was we tried to be very public, and we were an open source team. Everything that we did started as a GitHub repository. So whether it was an idea that somebody had, or whether we were starting a new project, there was a repository for it. The public could follow along and comment and code along with us if they wanted to. So open source was really at the heart of our value system. And then, the second piece in terms of transparency to our partners and other agencies, I think was the fact that we weren't sent to their door because something was on fire. We weren't that team. But we were a team in GSA acting like a consultancy. So the General Services Administration does a lot of business on behalf of other agencies in a lot of ways. They're the landlord for the federal government. They're the buyer of everything from pencils to tanks for the federal government. So they act on behalf of the federal government, and often, there are fees associated with that. There's all kinds of ways that GSA operates. And so we were in that machine, which simply by that fact made us different. The way we were created and funded was through a fund inside GSA called the Acquisition Services Fund. And it's essentially their fund that allows them to be a buyer, make investments, and know that they're going to get paid back for those. And so since we were funded by that, we were kind of beholden to that same, statute, which was, this is money, but it's got to get paid back. So we had a relationship with partners and partner agencies where we would do work with them, but we were consultants. They had to pay us. So we did the work for a fee. And I think that created both accountability to our partners, because there is kind of this client relationship. But it also meant that those folks had skin in the game in a different way. We weren't just showing up at their door with, our fire hats on, but we were showing up like really wanting to help them.
I don't know. I mean, showing up in fire hats could be a compelling thing just to send a message. But Dave, I'm sure listeners at this point are like, wow, 18F, great. I probably should have known about it before this podcast. Glad it existed. Very sad it now doesn't exist, but are still left asking, well, what did it actually do? Give me an example of a project or a project or two where 18F was actually doing the work we've talked about. What did that work actually look like? And critically, as you all point out in your forthcoming Lawfare piece, how was that work essential to then setting up the government generally, or having positive externalities on the government work going forward?
Yeah. So I love this question. So maybe the first thing, just to kind of maybe also contextualize even more kind of what Hillary was just talking about, which is the United States was unique. So I've been studying governments around the world and how they're kind of grappling with this problem. And the US government was kind of unique in that it had two teams, not just one, but two teams that were kind of doing this. And one of the things that's so powerful is, you have this other team called the United States Digital Service, which is where DOGE has kind of taken over that part. And it was a group that went in, and it would get it in its early days. It was the group with the fire hats. Like, they would go often, sometimes when directed, to projects that were in crisis. And I kind of jokingly in the piece I was talking about, like, they're the Marine Corps, and they kind of like, they show up and they're like, we're here to help. And if you kind of say, well, I don't think I need any help, and you're like, then you're really not going to like the next phone call you get. It's like we're not really asking. And that was very powerful, and it gave them real leverage. But they were really there to go solve a problem, whether you liked it or not. Whereas I think what was so powerful with 18F is they were the Peace Corps. They only went where they were invited, and they were going to work with you. And they were only going to work with you if you asked them to come in. And so not everybody wanted them to come. Not everybody asked, but the places that did ask knew that they needed to figure something out and do something differently. And so you had kind of like, they went where there were coalitions of the willing that wanted to change. And I think like that's a really wonderful story. And part of what makes it wonderful is that they changed the way people worked and thought. It's hilarious. Hillary doesn't even know this. Just yesterday, I was doing an interview for another case study that I'm writing about .flow, the Department of Transport's Flow project, which is this kind of data trust that they've created around shipping data that was used to help prevent the backlogs at the ports. So like nobody knew what was going on at the ports, nobody had any data. And so they created this kind of data trust where the shipping companies actually trusted them to hold the data so they could analyze and predict when there might be problems. And in the middle of this interview, a DOT employee suddenly says, yes. And we invited 18F in, and they walked us through the way to think about this, because they're like, we are regulators. And suddenly we weren't using our regulatory tools. We had to go build something that people wanted to use, and that had to be compelling and interesting to them. Like, they were going to have to volunteer to participate. And we just had no way of thinking about that. And I wish I almost had this person here, because they were genuinely transformed by the experience and the way it made them think about their job, and the way they interact with the people they serve, and the way they think about their relationship with citizens, and the way they think about their relationship with technology. So that for me is a great example of kind of like the power of what 18F does when it was operating its best. But the second thing that I really want to hammer home on, which I don't think was intended when 18F started, was the way it evolved to become something I think even more powerful than initially conceived. So what we've really talked about are these kind of interventions. And so 18F would get invited in, it would do kind of project work, and that's where it started. But I think the thing that then happened is that the team started to see patterns. Like, the problems didn't just occur once. It was like, oh, we had the same problem here, and the same problem here, and the same problem. So then they began to write guidance. Hey, what is the way that we could solve this problem to help their own teams? But then they're like, because as Hillary said, let's make it all open. So then they shared it with the whole world, not just the government, the whole world. And that helped scale these solutions. And then they said, wow, we keep building the same solutions over and over again to solve these problems. So then they started to make products. And so now you had a product line where you were starting to build products that people were using, and they opened those products up. So anybody, even people they weren't working with, could come and download and use those products. And then some of those products became so valuable and so important that they eventually kind of transformed into a kind of infrastructure where they were core tools that the government could use and rely on, that were being run internally at a fraction of the cost of procuring them. And I think that evolution of taking things from advice to consulting to product and then to infrastructure is almost unique from what I've seen around the world. There are people who get into the infrastructure phase, but it's through a different, very, very unique story that I think is a particular contribution of 18F.
And without getting too political, because we've talked about a lot of positives for 18F, Hillary, I'm going to put you in a tough position because I'm a law professor and I get to cold call on students and it scares them. And now I'm partially cold calling on you. So what's the argument against 18F? Who was opposing this work in terms of creating novel products, in terms of collaborating with agencies, identifying these positive way forward? So if you could walk us through both when 18F was at its zenith, things are going best, who's opposing 18F in that scenario? And then if you could also walk us through 2025, what pushed 18F onto that cut list and ultimately resulted in its demise?
Yeah, if you do a Google search for 18F, you will well, now the results are all about what happened in March. But before that, you would see kind of articles that would run the gamut from talking about the incredible work that the team shipped in terms of the kinds of things that David was just talking about. So building cloud.gov, a platform as a service for the government. Just incredible. Login.gov, analytics.usa.gov. And then, not to mention all of the sort of program specific work that the team did over 10 years. So incredible work, lots of coverage on that. But two things kind of always dogged the team. One was just there was resistance from the beginning, from external DC media vendors, to see this group of kids come in wearing their flip-flops and, shaking things up. And, even though I truly do not believe it was warranted, there was always chatter about bringing these kids in from Silicon Valley who think they know better than us. And the number of folks actually from Silicon Valley was pretty small, but that was the mentality of why are you bringing these folks in? They don't know any better than us. They don't know our business. And so folks external to government, vendors, DC media, were more than happy to pile onto that because there was, I think, just resistance to a team of smart, capable folks inside government building things at a fraction of the cost. So there was resistance, whether it was from vendor community or from media or just from other parts of, well, if I'm honest, other parts of GSA. So that we always tried to build a narrative to overcome that, and to really go into meetings with current and new partners, in a way that always showed empathy, always showed that, like, your business, here's what we know, let's work together because that's going to make magic.
And if I could just pause you for just 1 second, because if I were listening to this and I hadn't heard you say the words 18F, and I just really want you to double down on this because it'll tee us up nicely for the end here, which is, so you mentioned a bunch of kids in flip-flops. They're younger. They say they know how to fix things. They're kind of pointing out wild suggestions that no one's heard of. Can you just describe again? So we have, you all were transparent with the blog. You only came at the invitation of the agency. Is there anything else that you really think made the 18F distinct from a sort of move fast and break things? Because that may be the connotation that people have coming into their mind. What else made it a partner more so than the angry consultant or I won't say McKinsey, but let's imagine a consultancy that comes in and says, we're just going to tell you what to do. Are there any other sort of formal or informal safeguards that you saw that made 18F more in that collaborative fashion?
Yeah, 18F and USDS both often started with, which is kind of a an industry term, and if you're building products in the private sector, but we would often start with a discovery sprint. So that's it's a couple weeks where you're just really getting to know the partner, their problem, some of the users, et cetera. Like you're just trying to wrap your head around the problem. You're doing some user research. Maybe during that time you do a couple paper prototypes so you can try something out with actual users. But the idea is that you're trying to wrap your head around the problem. You're not coming in claiming to say that, claiming to know how to fix whatever you're there to do. And I think that's an empathy tool. It's an empathy building tool, and it's what good product developers do. They do user research, they try to wrap their head around the problem, and they identify the user stories that are going to actually create good outcomes for people.
I really appreciate that point, because it really crystallizes the difference between identifying a solution and telling the agency how to implement it versus hearing about a problem and working through what the solution could look like. And I think that's a critical distinction.
Yeah, and we didn't have anything, out of the box or that we built before, so we were different from vendors. We weren't coming in saying, we've done this with this thing before, and all you have to do is turn it on. We know your problem so well, just turn it on. So it was a big difference.
And Dave, I cut Hillary off earlier. I'd love you to build upon that. And if you could also talk about what ultimately motivated the demise of 18F in March.
I do think, like, the critiques of 18F, I think it depends on where you're standing. But I think there's always some challenges teams like this face. So the first is if you have a group of people where you say, this is kind of where the newness is happening, this is where the innovation is happening, this is where the new practices are, it is it runs the risk of sounding like an implicit critique of everybody else. And that and a lot of other people, they're doing great work, they're struggling in the trenches, and suddenly there's this other group that suddenly has a spotlight on them and is maybe given different resources, maybe it's even given more latitude, and that can breed resentment. And this is a challenge. Any innovation team, any enterprise, but especially in government, will suffer from this challenge. And so you actually have to kind of work harder to be friendlier. You have to work harder to be humble. You got to work harder to kind of spread the limelight in order to not be perceived that way. So I think there's always that challenge that you face. And then the other challenge is 18F and USDS, but I think 18F in particular really was challenging a consensus position that had emerged in many governments, which is that governments weren't really competent. They couldn't do things, and that things are best outsourced. And this notion that actually it might be cheaper and more effective and create more value if you build things in-house was very threatening to a lot of people. And you couldn't allow that to succeed, because if it succeeded in this domain, my gosh, that blows the entire thesis of this consensus apart. Maybe government's going to start building more capacity in other domains too. And so there were a set of private sector vendors that were deeply concerned about its mere existence, even before it had any successes, because any success would present a threat. And I don't think you should underestimate the challenge that those two things posed. I think the sad truth of, it's funny, I was joking around earlier, I've got my Clue little envelope here, and I think it says Doge in the executive office with an Exchange server. And I think I just won. But I think the sad truth of the demise is 18F was filled with, there's two ways of cutting what's happening with Doge. One is there's just a kind of, let's shrink government. But there is a belief out there that we're going to go after the parts of government where it is believed people who believe in state capacity and are more skewed towards the left tend to be hanging out. And there are tweets and quotes from Musk basically saying, this team we got to get rid of because it's filled with kind of basically Democrats or left-leaning people, which I don't think was entirely true, and I don't think was fair. And so I think that my big fear is that more than any kind of rational assessment about the capacity, because is what drove it, which is kind of doubly ironic because actually there is an element of this administration that actually does believe to some degree, a small degree, in state capacity in certain ways. And so this team could have actually been serving that interest really, really well.
And if I could, quickly, Kevin, what David started with there in terms of, 18F, these digital service teams, I think kind of writ large, but their their attitude is not always like move fast and break things, but it is move fast and test things, and it is a fundamental belief that we can do better, that government can do better, that we can deliver better service. And I think that in and of itself, it builds a certain, it attracts a certain kind of person, it builds a certain kind of team. And, I think 18F has always, and a lot of digital service teams probably have been filled with folks that, like David started with, have just kind of said, this isn't going well and we need to do it better. And that's just a hard message, I think, for some folks to hear.
We said back when we did the PIF trainings, we used to talk about, actually, I would do a lot of work with the PIFs. We talked about like the 3 archetypes of the PIFs, which is actually a little bit of the archetypes of the type of people who end up in 18F. But with the PIFs in particular, there were 3. There was the careerist who was like, this will just look good on my CV. I'm going to show up. I'm going to do a year of duty. I feel some sense of responsibility. I'm going to do a year of duty, and then I'm going to move on to the next thing, and it'll be great. And then there were the believers, the people who were like, I believe in product management, I believe in design, I believe in open source. And they were like, I'm going to come and inject this belief into government because I think it'll be better. And these people, they really believed that they could help make government better by bringing this knowledge they had and unleashing it inside this beast and making it better. And then there were the patriots who were like, I'll never be asked to join the Marine Corps. I'm not in good enough shape, or I'm just like not the right person. That's not me. I'm not going to serve that way, but I'm here to serve. And you really saw those 3 people. And what was interesting is they would sometimes people would arrive as careerists and be like, I'm here for a year. And then they would become patriots. Like they do the work and they're like, I'm sold. Like sign me up for 20 years. I'm in. And some people would come as a believer, and then they'd be like, they'd become a patriot, or maybe they'd just become a career. So like, this was harder than I thought. I'm going to do my year, inject what I can, and I'm going to get out. But people, they showed up wanting to serve in some capacity.
And unfortunately, we have to move into the rapid question. So Dave, I'm going to start with you, and I'm going to give Hillary the last word here. So Dave, the 48th president of the United States shows up and says, Dave, I want to restart 18F. What's one reason I should, and what's one reform I should consider?
Oh, that's a great question. So I think the answer is definitely yes. And the reason you should is that pipeline that I talked about moving things from discovery and kind of advice to infrastructure, is so important for a digital era government. We have to have government that was like a sensory, everything. It was a sensory thing. We would go and find problems, identify problems, categorize and identify what problems had patterns, and then figured out how to solve those problems at scale. Like how to address those patterns at scale is such an important function to have inside any enterprise. And most important inside like a government, an organization as large as the United States government. So that for me is like a very compelling reason. And that thing pays off dividends in the short term through small projects, but over a 10-year or 20-year period can pay off huge dividends as that infrastructure builds up and starts to solve lots of problems at scale. That's the big advice I'd give. I think the thing that I would do differently is I would be pushing for ways to rethink how we do hiring, because the problem of 18F is actually that it shouldn't just be an 18F. We need more. We need to unleash people across the government. There's lots of great talent already inside the government that I think is constrained, but we also make it easier for new talent to come in. And that's never a fun thing for administration to do because it doesn't get you votes, but it's the kind of thing that builds capacity that makes government more effective.
Okay, so Dave's calling for an 18G, an 18H, and an 18I. Hillary, how about you? One reason to restart it and one reform you'd consider?
I think the reason to restart it is pretty simply just about delivery. You need in-house talent wrapping their heads around the problem and telling you where to go from there. You don't need vendors telling you what your problem is and telling you this is the best way to solve that problem.
I don't know. New Yorkers might say, hey, they helped us point out that our trash cans aren't as readily available as they need to be. That was facetious. But yes, this is good. Good.
But I think that's, for me, that's the bottom line is just back to that line. It was maybe Robin Carnahan that I stole it from, but government has outsourced its mission and we have to insource it. We have to take accountability for outcomes. We have to understand what the problems are. And we have to do that in a user-centered way so that the policies we create and the tools to implement those policies meet the needs. Because that's product development, but that's product development in government. And that's how it's different, is this kind of marriage of policy and delivery that various teams sort of skew toward one or the other and try to get it right. But I think we can continue to work on getting those two things to ship together. What would I change? I think in addition to just really needing to break hiring for the federal government, and maybe that's the lasting thing that DoD has left us with, is that there will be a lot that needs to be rebuilt. I think the creation of teams is what David was talking about. Like, I think a centralized team that can drive that need around the marriage of policy and delivery is still super necessary, but we do have to be thinking about more diversified teams. And in order to do that, you got to think about a diversified funding model. So, we can't just pray that each administration is going to work us into appropriations and is going to give us money. I think it was in October, USDS actually crossed the bridge from being fully appropriated into doing some cost recovery work because they weren't sure about their budget. So we have to think about diversified funding and what's going to lead to longevity.
Praying for money hasn't worked for me yet, so I think that's a particularly good reform. With that, Dave, Hillary, thank you so much for joining. We'll have to leave it there, but I trust we'll find some way to bring you both on again at some point down the road. So thanks, folks.
Thank you.